They said the silence followed her, a shroud woven from deference and disregard in equal measure. At forward operating base Nightingale, nestled in a valley that had swallowed armies for centuries, Eleanora Vance was a ghost long before the fighting started. She was the chief technical liaison for the Cerberus network, a title so bloated with bureaucracy it was effectively camouflage. To the swaggering lieutenants fresh from War College and the weary colonel running on fumes and regret, she was just Nora, the middle-aged woman with quiet hands and eyes that held the flat, calm gray of a winter sea. She was a fixture like the dust that settled on everything or the distant thrum of the generators. Necessary, but unseen. Unremarkable. This was a profound miscalculation. The base hummed with a nervous energy that scraped at the nerves. Colonel Graves, a man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten battles, saw Nora as a relic. A legacy appointment foisted upon him by a high command that liked to tidy its books by sending its past prime assets to quiet corners of the world until their pensions kicked in. He would nod at her in the mess hall, a curt, dismissive gesture, his mind already on the latest intelligence report warning of insurgent activity. The reports spoke of a new leader, a phantom known only as the architect, who was orchestrating attacks with chilling precision. Graves saw threats in the shadows of the valley, in the flicker of a distant fire, but never in the woman who maintained the very system meant to guard against them. Younger officers were worse. Lieutenant Kalin, the base's fire control officer, was a prodigy of the digital age. He operated his world through touchscreens and predictive algorithms, his confidence as bright and brittle as the glowing icons on his console. He treated Nora with a patient condescension that was more insulting than outright hostility. He saw her insistence on daily physical diagnostics of the Cerberus system, her meticulous cleaning of fiber optic ports and manual calibration of targeting sensors, as the quaint hobby of an analog mind lost in a digital world. The system's self-diagnoses, Nora, he'd told her once, a smirk playing on his lips. We have software for that. She had simply looked at him, her gaze unwavering, and said, "Software can be lied to." He had laughed and walked away, shaking his head. Only a few saw past the quiet facade. Private First Class Evans, a lanky kid from a town with more churches than stoplights, had been assigned to her. He watched her work. He saw the economy of her movements, the way her hands, scarred and calloused around the knuckles, moved over complex circuitry with the grace of a concert pianist. He saw the way she spoke to the machine, not in words, but in a language of touch and rhythm. She would lay a hand on the central server rack of the Cerberus system, a monolithic block of black metal and humming circuits, and close her eyes as if listening for a heartbeat. Evans, who had grown up fixing tractors with his father, recognized the intimacy between a master and their machine. He never questioned her methods. He just watched and learned and kept his mouth shut. Nora carried her history in the marrow of her bones and in a faint tattoo just above her wrist, usually hidden by the cuff of her uniform. It was a ghost owl, its wings flared for a silent strike, its eyes wide and all-seeing. It was the sigil of a unit that officially never existed, a whisper in the high echelons of power. It was the mark of Nyx, a call sign that had once been synonymous with the impossible, a name spoken with a mixture of terror and reverence in the darkest corners of the world. But Nyx was a ghost, and Nora was just a technician. She kept it that way. The past was a locked room, and she had no intention of opening the door. The architect began to tighten his net. His attacks grew bolder. An IED on a patrol route, a sniper team picking at the perimeter guards, a sophisticated cyber attack that briefly blinded the base's long-range sensors. Each move was designed to test, to provoke, to learn. Colonel Graves grew more ragged, his temper fraying. He saw patterns where there were none and missed the ones forming right in front of him. Kalin assured him the firewalls were holding, that the insurgents were amateurs. Nora, after a 16-hour diagnostic, filed a report that no one read. It stated, with clinical precision, that the outer network nodes were being systematically mapped and that the Cerberus system's external links were being spoofed. She recommended a full network isolation and a return to manual operation. The report was buried under a mountain of digital paperwork. Then came the bait. A piece of high-value intelligence. A supposed meeting of the architect and his lieutenants in a village 20 clicks to the north. It was too good to be true, a perfect solution handed to them on a silver platter. Graves, desperate for a decisive victory, bit hard. He rallied 2/3 of the base's combat strength, a column of armor and infantry, and rolled out at dusk, leaving behind a skeleton crew to guard the fort. Nora watched them go from the low roof of the maintenance bay, the wind whipping loose strands of graying hair across her face. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, the familiar weight of impending violence. It felt like coming home. As the last vehicle disappeared into the gloom of the valley, the attack came. It wasn't with rockets or mortars. It was with silence. One by one, the systems began to die. The satellite link winked out. The radio frequencies dissolved into a roar of static. The digital displays in the Command Information Center, Kalen's domain, flickered and went black, replaced by a single, mocking icon cycling on the main screen. A stylized blueprint, the mark of the architect. The base was deaf, dumb, and blind. Panic, a cold and greasy thing, began to seep through the command center. Kalen frantically rebooted systems, his fingers stabbing at dead touchscreens. His digital world had vanished. "It's a complete blackout," he stammered, his voice thin. "He's locked us out of everything." Colonel Graves, miles away and driving into an ambush, was screaming into a dead radio. The trap had been sprung. FOB Nightingale was alone. But not every line was dead. In the heavily shielded, climate-controlled heart of the Cerberus control hub, a single hardline telephone, a relic of a bygone era that Nora insisted on maintaining, sat on its cradle. It was connected to nothing but the system's own internal comms and a single, buried copper line that snaked its way to an old exchange outside the valley. It was an analog ghost, untraceable by the digital phantoms that had crippled the base. As the emergency lights bathed the room in a hellish red glow, the phone began to ring. The sound was shrill, alien in the suffocating silence. Kalen and the two other technicians in the room stared at it, as if it were a venomous snake. Nora walked past them, her face impassive, and lifted the receiver. She didn't speak. She just listened. A voice, smooth and cultured, filled with arrogant amusement, slithered down the line. "Hello, Nightingale. Do you hear the silence? Is the sound of my hand on your throat?" Nora's grip on the receiver tightened, almost imperceptibly. Her knuckles went white. The voice chuckled. It was a wet, condescending sound. "I must admit, your colonel is a predictable man. An old dog who still chases thrown sticks. Who did he leave to mind the castle? The clerks? The cooks?" There was a pause. The man on the other end was savoring his victory. "I can hear you breathing, little mouse. Are you frightened? You should be. 200 of my best men are about to come over your walls. We will be thorough. Tell me, who am I speaking to? I like to know the names of the people whose worlds I am ending." Kalen was pale, his bravado shattered. He looked at Nora, expecting to see fear. Instead, he saw a stillness so profound it was terrifying. It was the stillness of a deep lake just before the storm breaks. Nora held the receiver to her ear, her eyes on the main console of the Cerberus system. It was dark, inert, just another dead machine. But she could feel its pulse, the dormant power waiting within. The ghost owl on her wrist seemed to burn beneath her sleeve. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the first sign of life she'd shown. The air filled her lungs, cold and clean. The voice on the phone was still talking, mocking her, mocking the base, mocking the years of her life she had poured into this silent, thankless work. He was mocking the locked room inside her. And with his words, he had just handed her the key. She brought the receiver to her lips. Her voice, when it came, was low, devoid of heat or fear. It was the sound of gravel and ice. "You talk too much," she said, and placed the receiver gently back in its cradle, cutting the connection. For a moment, the room was frozen. Then Nora moved. She turned to Kalen, her expression unreadable. "Get out of the chair." It wasn't a request. Kalen, stunned into obedience, stumbled back. Nora slid into the command seat. The main screen was still displaying the architect's mocking logo. The control surfaces were dark. "He's locked us out," Kalen repeated weakly. "The OS is completely compromised." "He locked the door," Nora said, her voice still quiet. "He forgot about the windows." Her right hand moved to a panel below the main console, a featureless plate of metal. She pressed her thumb to a specific spot. There was a low click, and the plate slid away, revealing not a screen or a keypad, but a series of heavy, industrial-looking toggle switches and dials, their markings etched directly into the metal. It was the system's manual override, a purely mechanical interface that bypassed the primary operating system entirely. It was the part of the machine Kalen had dismissed as an antique. Her fingers danced over the switches, flipping them in a precise, memorized sequence. With each click, a section of the massive server rack behind her lit up with a solid green light. It was a process of awakening, like bringing life to a golem. She was bypassing the compromised digital brain and connecting directly to the system's iron heart. The low hum of the room deepened into a powerful thrum of raw energy. The main screen flickered, the architect's logo vanishing, replaced by a raw data feed, a topographical map of the valley, stark and unadorned. Red icons, hundreds of them, began to bloom at the perimeter, swarming toward the walls. "The enemy." "External sensors are still down," Kalen whispered, staring at the raw data. "How are you seeing them?" "I'm not using the sensors," Nora said, her eyes fixed on the display. Her left hand gripped a heavy, polished steel trackball set into the console, while her right hovered over a set of 3 firing studs. "I'm using the earth, seismic and acoustic resonance. He can jam the airwaves, but he can't jam the ground." Outside, the first wave of the architect's men hit the outer wall. They moved with confidence, expecting to meet only panicked, sporadic rifle fire. They met Cerberus instead. The system was a network of 20 automated weapons platforms dug into the earth around the base. 12 were kinetic turrets, armed with high-velocity cannons. 8 were directed energy projectors, experimental weapons that fired invisible lances of coherent heat. Under Kalen's digital control, they were imprecise, good for suppression, but not for surgical work. Under Nora's direct manual command, they became instruments of a master. Her left hand moved the trackball in short, fluid motions, designating targets on the raw topographical map. Her right thumb depressed the first firing stud. Far out on the perimeter, a kinetic turret, silent until this moment, swiveled and fired a single shot. The sound was a sharp, brutal crack, like the sky splitting open. A click away, the insurgent officer leading the Western assault vanished in a cloud of pink mist. Another flick of the trackball, another press of the stud. A heavy machine gun emplacement at the base of the wall erupted in a shower of shrapnel. It wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. Nora's movements were a blur of efficiency. She was not a soldier firing a weapon. She was a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. Each shot was perfectly timed, perfectly placed. She targeted leaders first, then heavy weapons, then communication specialists. She dismantled their command structure before they could even understand what was happening. Her eyes, narrowed in concentration, scanned the data flowing across her screen. She saw not just targets, but trajectories, velocities, intent. She saw the ghost of a man trying to rally his squad and erased him. She saw a team setting up a mortar and vaporize their position with a silent pulse from an energy projector. In the control room, the other technicians could only watch, their faces illuminated by the stark light of the console. Kalen stood frozen, his digital world rendered meaningless by the analog fury he was witnessing. He was watching a living legend perform her art, and he was realizing with dawning horror that he had treated a goddess of war like a janitor. The air crackled with power. The rhythmic, percussive beat of the cannons outside was the only sound. Thump crack, a pause. Thump crack, a pause. It was the steady, patient rhythm of a predator. The enemy, so confident moments before, broke. They had not been fought. They had been executed. Panic replaced discipline. They scattered, running for the shadows, but there was no escape. Nora's targeting was relentless. She wasn't just killing them. She was hurting them, pushing the survivors into pre-selected kill zones where multiple turrets had overlapping fields of fire. The slaughter was absolute. In the space of 4 minutes, an organized assault by 200 elite fighters was reduced to a panicked rout. In 2 more minutes, there was nothing left but silence and the smell of ozone. On the screen, the red icons had vanished. Nora's hand slowed, then stopped. She ran a final diagnostic, her movements once again calm and methodical. The system was green across the board. The heat sinks were stable. The ammunition counts were updated. She had expended exactly 212 rounds and 16 energy pulses. Efficiency in all things. Miles away, in a command bunker buried deep underground, a 4-star general named Marcus Thorne was listening to a garbled, panicked report from Colonel Graves' doomed convoy, which had finally realized the trap. The report was cut short, but not before a junior officer managed to relay the chaos at Nightingale. "Sir," the voice had crackled, "something's happening at the FOB. Massive defensive fire. The pattern, it's methodical. Surgical. I've never seen anything like it." General Thorne went very still. He had seen it before. Once. A long time ago, in a city of dust and ghosts. "Describe the firing pattern," he commanded, his voice sharp. "Rhythmic, sir. Almost elegant. One shot, one target. It's like someone is hunting them." Thorne closed his eyes. He didn't need any more information. There was only one person on the planet who fought like that, who could turn a defensive system into a predator's tool. A ghost he himself had helped put into hiding. "That's not a system," he said, his voice a low whisper that carried across the command center. "That's Nyx." He opened his eyes, his expression hard as granite. "Give me a channel to Colonel Graves. Scramble everything we have. Tell him to turn his men around. Tell him the threat at his base has been neutralized. And tell him to find his technical liaison. Now." By the time Colonel Graves' battered convoy limped back to the FOB at dawn, the scene was surreal. The valley outside the walls was a graveyard. Wreckage and bodies littered the ground in patterns of chilling geometry. But inside the wire, the base was pristine. Untouched. Not a single bullet hole marred the buildings. He stormed into the command center, his face black with fury and confusion, demanding answers. He found the room quiet. The emergency lights were off. His officers, including a deeply humbled Lieutenant Kalen, were standing around, looking at the main console where a woman in a simple maintenance uniform was calmly running a post-operation cool-down sequence. It was Nora. Graves opened his mouth to yell, but the words died in his throat. Private Evans, his young face filled with a reverence usually reserved for saints, stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She saved us. She saved all of us." Graves looked from Evans to Kalen, who could only give a slow, stunned nod. Then he looked at Nora. She was focused on her work, her movements precise and unhurried. As she reached to wipe a smudge from a monitor, her sleeve slid back an inch. In the clean, morning light filtering into the room, Graves saw it clearly for the first time. The faded ink of a ghost owl, its wings spread for a silent, deadly stoop. Everything clicked into place. The strange posting, her impossible calm, the quiet competence that he had mistaken for irrelevance. The report from General Thorne crackling over his command channel on the way back, a name he hadn't heard in a decade. Nyx. He wasn't looking at a technician. He was looking at a legend he thought was dead or buried in a file, so black it didn't exist. He, a full colonel, had been dismissing one of the most effective and dangerous operators the military had ever produced. The arrogance of it, the sheer blindness, washed over him, leaving him cold and hollow. Humiliation was a bitter pill to swallow. Nora finished her sequence. The system was back in its standard dormant state. She slid out of the command chair, her joints cracking softly. She looked at Kalen, who flinched as her gaze fell on him. "Always check the hard lines," she said. Her voice was soft, not a rebuke, but a simple statement of fact. It was the most devastating lesson he would ever learn. She didn't wait for thanks or explanations. She didn't look at Colonel Graves or acknowledge the awe-filled stares of the others. Her work was done. The machine was safe. The silence she craved was restored. She turned and walked out of the command center, her footsteps making no sound on the tiled floor. Colonel Graves watched her go, speechless. He saw her cross the dusty compound, her shoulders straight, her pace unhurried, heading back toward the quiet anonymity of the maintenance bay. As she passed through the long shadow of the command tower, the rising sun caught her for a moment. He saw her raise a hand to brush a stray piece of hair from her face, a simple, human gesture. On her wrist, the ghost owl seemed to glint for a second, a secret promise of silent violence, before it was once again swallowed by the cuff of her sleeve. She disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a group of men who had just witnessed a ghost teach them the meaning of war, and a colonel who finally understood that the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal wasn't a machine, but the quiet woman he had never bothered to see.